My old love is distillation of whiskey, about which I've had many years of training. With the knowledge gained by contract, the making of whiskey in Kentucky for nearly 35 years, I found in the warm months of the years, we had our best fermentation, biggest yield, and best whiskey. These are the words of J.T.S. Brown, a trailblazer and one of Kentucky's legendary whiskey-making families. In the late 1800s, he and his family spent their time right here, behind the facade of what is now Hotel Distill, on this street, in this city.
Louisville is a very important part for bourbon history from the very beginning because Louisville is the center of transportation out of Kentucky.
The kinship between Louisville and bourbon is no coincidence. In addition to its proximity to railroads and the Ohio River, its climate, which ranges from chilly winters to hot summers, just so happens to be the perfect temperature range for proper aging. And of course, there's something in the water. It's a phrase that's meant literally in the context of Louisville's bourbon production. The city resides on large amounts of blue limestone, which filters impurities out of the water and gives it its signature taste. All these factors combined lead to create one of the most extraordinary blocks in America, Whiskey Row. After the Civil War, the 100 block of West Main Street enjoyed a boom that made Louisville a vibrant, rich city, the second most populous in the South behind New Orleans. The street, a collection of revivalist and Chicago school-style buildings with cast iron fronts, became the official home to sales offices, bottling facilities, and warehouses that supported the town's signature spirit.
Now let's think about that block of West Main. You would have heard the grinding perhaps of steel wheels on rails being accompanied by the clippity-clop of mule-drawn cars. You would have heard the train whistles from the rail yard to the rear. There would have been the sounds of the street.
Kentucky is the birthplace of bourbon, crafting 95% of the world's supply. Since the beginning, bourbon has been aged in charred American oak barrels, which provides its signature color and distinctive taste. It's not just tradition that continues that practice, it's also the law. The federal standards of identity for bourbon state that in addition to being aged in charred oak barrels, bourbon must also contain at least 51% corn, be distilled at 160 proof or less, and contain no additives. Any deviation, and you simply don't have bourbon. But the tale of where bourbon got its name is not as clear.
My theory is that bourbon isn't named after Bourbon County, but it's named after Bourbon Street. As people down there were down there drinking this whiskey, particularly, after 1818, steamboats turned this year-long trip by flatboat to a 2 or 3 month trip. And you're coming back on the flatboat and you ask the bartender, I really like that whiskey I was drinking on Bourbon Street. Can you give me some of that Bourbon Street whiskey? Or eventually give me some of that bourbon whiskey.
There's probably, with 1,800 craft distillers in the United States now, and the 10 major distillers, there's probably 5,000 brands of American whiskey and bourbon on the market. There's only around 33 bottle and bonds.
One of the most storied bottle and bond bourbons has to be J.T.S. Brown, made famous in pop culture thanks to The Hustler, a book by Walter Tevis that ultimately became a movie by the same name, featuring Paul Newman and Jackie Gleason.
The main character in that movie, in that novel, was Fast Eddie Felson, who was a young, cocky, very talented pool player. He was a pool shark. Fast Eddie Felson says, "Preacher, here, go get me a bottle of J.T.S. Brown. No ice, no glass." He's just gonna drink it right out of the bottle. He can afford any whiskey. He wants JTS Brown.
But who was the family behind the iconic bourbon? The Brown family were pioneers in Kentucky. The patriarchs of the family, William Brown and his wife Hannah Street, settled in rural Kentucky. Their son, John Thompson Street Brown, or JTS as he was known, was born in 1793. He served as a merchant, postmaster, and even a major in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. JTS married twice. By his first marriage, he had 8 children, including eldest son JTS Brown Jr. By his second marriage, 17 years later, he welcomed son George Garvin Brown. Turns out, JTS Brown Jr. was quite the character. He moved from rural Kentucky to Louisville, started a wholesale liquor business, and married Emily Graham. Together, they also would go on to have 8 children, 2 girls and 6 boys. JTS Brown Jr.'s wholesale liquor business grew dramatically during the Civil War. Selling liquor to the troops, he had amassed a significant fortune. By then, his half-brother George Garvin Brown joined the firm, and they relocated to Whiskey Row. The 2 brothers raised money to start what would become the Old Forester brand, but ultimately split in 1874, with George going on to found Brown-Forman. JTS Jr. marched forward with his own distillery, JTS Brown & Sons. Working side by side with his boys, their wholesale and warehouse operations relocated to 105 Main Street in an 1870s building on Whiskey Row.
JTS Brown moved into that next building and occupied it until 1905, when they moved into the more dramatic even, the white glazed brick with the JTS Brown around the door.
The new building was a statement, dramatically contrasting other nearby buildings with a custom cast iron JTS Brown & Sons nameplate directly over the entrance. The white glazed terracotta facade was one of the first of its kind, replacing traditional brownstone terracotta. Behind those doors, the family would operate the old Prentice Distillery, bottling facility, and warehouse. But before he could see the building finished, JTS Brown Jr. died in 1905. By then, the JTS Brown brand had become quite successful by the standards of the day. His sons, Graham, Davis, JTS III, Creel, and Hewitt, had taken over operations and continued to grow the company. In 1910, Creel moved the old Prentice brand to Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, and built a large Spanish Mission-style distillery that ultimately would become the Four Roses brand. The distillery was buzzing with activity. But soon, everything would change. On January 17, 1920, the United States enacted a nationwide constitutional ban on the production, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages, unleashing a spiral of unintended consequences.
Barrel after barrel of prize whiskey is destroyed by government agents.
The job market suffered. Not only did Prohibition put distilleries like JTS Brown out of business, but it affected the people that made the bottles, as well as the people that made the labels. Saloons and liquor stores were closed, laying off bartenders and servers. Prohibition also hurt the railroads as the shipping of all whiskey and spirits ceased. Even the newspapers were impacted as distilleries stopped advertising.
By 1928, people knew that Prohibition wasn't going to work. Crime became a problem. Drinking became a problem. Drinking actually went up during Prohibition. More people drank during Prohibition than they did before. But what spelled the doom for Prohibition is taxes. Because before the income tax amendment, the distilling tax, the tax on distilled spirits, was paying about 50 to 70% of the federal budget. Somebody figured out in 29 or 30 that the amount of money that the government was in debt was equal to 1 year's tax on legal alcohol sales.
On December 5th, 1933, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was repealed.
Acting Secretary of State William Phillips is signing the 21st Amendment, and Prohibition is repealed.
Liquor was legal again. But JTS Brown and Sons had been wiped out financially, and there was a long road ahead for the bourbon industry.
Canada, Scotland didn't have a prohibition, so on December 6th, 1933, they're flooding their brands into the United States. So they got a 4-year head start on everybody, right?
American bourbon makers were facing all sorts of challenges as they worked to regain market share and return to the glory days of Whiskey Row. The Brown family soon realized they had different visions for the JTS Brown brand. In September 1933, a few months before repeal was officially enacted, JTS Brown III incorporated a new firm named the JTS Brown Distillery Company. 10 days later, his brother Creel Brown applied for and was granted a corporate charter under the name JTS Brown Son Distillery Company. A legal battle ensued. Ultimately, JTS III's interest in the whiskey business waned, and days after receiving approval for a new distillery building, Creel died of appendicitis. His son, Creel Jr., continued on to revive the brand for a number of years. In 1955, 100 years after its founding, the JTS Brown brand was officially sold and eventually became a member of the Heaven Hill family, keeping the JTS Brown family legacy alive. Today, the taste for bourbon has seen a huge resurgence.
It's not until the 21st century that you start seeing this growth of Whiskey Row. And it's led not so much by sales offices as actual distilleries now.
The historic preservation efforts of Whiskey Row buildings gained momentum. The JTS Brown complex of buildings at 105, 107, and 109 Main Street were named to the National Register of Historic Places, and new developments were moving forward. But then, tragedy struck. In 2015, a massive fire tore through Whiskey Row and reduced many of the buildings to rubble. But firefighters were able to save a few of the historic cast iron facades. Those facades, with so much history behind them, now stand proudly as the opening chapter to the Hotel Distill story.
I like the idea of keeping these old buildings and reusing them, keeping the facades at least. It'd been nice if they could have saved the whole building, but the fire prevented that.
To the extent that you can have a full smile, even in one case if it involves dramatic new construction, and in the next two cases it involves the preservation of the facades as well as new construction to the rear, then you pick up with the historic full smile.
When Hotel Distilled welcomed its first guests in 2019, it meant more than the opening of a beautiful hotel. It meant a new social center for Louisville. It meant new life for a storied building with unique spaces like Repeal, an oak-fired steakhouse designed to honor the history of JTS Brown and the repeal of Prohibition. And Bitters End, an authentic open-aired rooftop bar on Whiskey Row. A phoenix had risen from the ashes, revitalized, renewed. Whiskey Row was returning to glory. It was the beginning of a new story, the next chapter of a timeless narrative.
this song Distiller's Row because in the song I mentioned 23 bourbons in the song. I'll count along with you so you can keep up. My old granddad, he passed away, but he lived 94 years to the day. He's laid to rest right up on Heaven Hill with a spray of 4 roses on his grave. See how it works here? He'd drink a quart each and every day of some good store-bought Jim Beam. Dr. Forrester said, "Hey, Pappy, now you better cut it down." But then the good doc passed away, so who's to say? So raise a red-eye to old granddad, can't count that twice. He lived to be an ancient age. That old crow sure left his maker's mark, and now he's drinking with the angels far away. You should have 10 by now, so. When the weekends rolled around, oh, the stories they did flow like branch water pouring down Knob Creek. Evan Williams start to sing, Brother Elijah's voice would ring. Jimmy'd pass a jug to his buddy Parker Bean. So raise a red eye to old granddad, should have 16 now. He lived to be an ancient age. That old crow, he sure left his maker's mark, and now he's drinking with the angels far away. Wild turkeys they all were, and like eagles they were rare. They bottled and bonded all the day, and all into the night at Basil Hayden's sheer delight. They tell stories by the cabin, still they raise. Raise a red eye to old granddad, should have 20. He lived to be an ancient age. That old crow, he sure left his maker's mark, and now he's drinking with the angels far away. Where he left, he'd throw old fits if he didn't get his JTS. Now he's drinking there with the Booker far away.